But now let's leave Hegel and let's spend our last moments together today and let's talk about Kierkegaard. We can go either way. I think I need a little more time on Marx than I have, and I'd rather not. I think I can finish Kierkegaard in 25 minutes. Let's see if we can. There are two major enemies of Hegel in the first half of the the first half of the 19th century: Kierkegaard and Marx. In fact, I once taught a course at my state university called Hegel, Marx, and Kierkegaard. It makes a nice little course. A triad. A triad, right. So let's talk about Soren Kierkegaard. I'm going to write his name on the board, give you his dates, and let's see if we can finish Kierkegaard in the 25 minutes that we have. It might be better to pronounce his last name as Kierkegaard, but however it's pronounced, Soren is a major thinker. I want to find my dates for Kierkegaard. See, I've got all these pieces of paper. Here we are, 1813 to 1855. He was 42 years old when he died. He was Danish. He lived in Copenhagen, Denmark. Couple of points by way of introduction. There is also an incorrect interpretation of Kierkegaard that's been floating around for about half a century now. I'm somewhat embarrassed to mention this incorrect interpretation of Kierkegaard because I followed that view myself for half of my career. In other words, and I'm not proud of this, I think I misrepresented Kierkegaard to my students for at least a period of some 20 years. I am not going to do that to you, although I may, in the process, indicate to you what that incorrect interpretation of Kierkegaard is. In fact, I'll do that right now. It is a mistake, I think a serious misreading of Kierkegaard, to think of him as an enemy of reason, as an opponent of logic, as an irrationalist, a Christian irrationalist. Now, I guess in saying that, I'm disagreeing with Gordon Clark's handling of Kierkegaard. There are some very good philosophers who have done, I think, a very bad job of understanding Kierkegaard. To some extent, Kierkegaard deserves some of the blame for this because of his style of writing. He was not interested in setting out his position in a cold, calculating, rational way. He was a man who got excited about things, who picked up his pen, who often wrote in indirect discourse, who often communicated by means of stories and other points, who often, like a lot of preachers, exaggerated points in order to get people to meet him halfway, and in the process, I think, the man has been terribly misunderstood. Three thinkers in particular have helped, I think, rehabilitate Kierkegaard in our thinking. And I just want to give you their names and hope that perhaps someday you'll pick up some of their works. C. Stephen Evans is presently curator of the Kierkegaard Library up in St. Olaf. No, not St. Olaf. I don't mean St. Olaf. What? Obviously, I'm thinking of a television show here. What college does he teach at? Gustavus Adolphus? I can't even recall what college Steve teaches at. Anyway, there's a big Kierkegaard library there if you can get to the state of Minnesota. Another important Kierkegaard scholar today is a former colleague of mine named Robert Roberts. Bob's parents ran out of names, I guess. I have no other way to figure that out. Roberts, he does have a middle initial, C, but I don't know what C stands for. Robert C. Roberts. And then Merrill Westphal, who's now teaching at Fordham University. Each of these men has published important studies of Kierkegaard, and their work has persuaded me that it really is an injustice to Kierkegaard to think of him as an irrationalist. In one of the footnotes in The Word of God and the Mind of Man, I mention a couple of articles that Stephen Evans has written, in which, among other things, he points out that Kierkegaard's writings simply don't make sense unless you understand him as presupposing the law of non-contradiction. Now, to be sure, Kierkegaard frequently got very angry when he got to talking about reason. Even though this is not Kierkegaard's phrase, it wouldn't be at all out of character for Kierkegaard to talk about the bitch goddess of reason, all right? That's not his language, but Kierkegaard hates reason. But you must understand that when he talks about reason, it's not the law of non-contradiction. It's when he talks about reason, he means, for one thing, Hegel's understanding of reason. He means Hegel's system of philosophy. He hates Hegelianism, primarily because it leads to a false religion and because it is anti-Christian from the very core. But moreover, Steve Evans has pointed out in some of his articles, if you read Kierkegaard carefully, he does believe that God has revealed truth to us in the Bible. You see, Karl Barth and some existentialist theologians made a lot of use of Kierkegaard about 60 years ago. And what's happened is we've fallen into the mistake of thinking that Barth understood Kierkegaard correctly. Well, Gordon Clark misunderstood him, so did Karl Barth. Kierkegaard, unlike Barth, believed that the Bible contains revealed truth from God. You can't make sense out of Kierkegaard's writings without that assumption. So, we've got to understand Kierkegaard in a different way. What is that way? Well, I'll get to it, although it's beginning to look like I won't get to it today. Another point that I want to make by way of introduction. Kierkegaard is one of those rare philosophers whose life is inseparable from his thought. The other example that comes to mind is Augustine. You cannot understand Augustine's philosophy unless you understand how Augustine's life fits into it. Kierkegaard is the same way. Now, in the case of Kant, his life is irrelevant. You don't need to know about Kant's boring life to understand his thought. You don't have to know Hegel's life history to understand it. Well, how can you understand anything Hegel said? But certainly understanding his life is irrelevant. But Kierkegaard's life is inseparable from his thought. And so what I'm going to do, once I get off one more introductory point, is to begin a brief survey of Kierkegaard's life, and then I guess this will have to be carried over until next week. But the last point I want to make by way of introduction to Kierkegaard is a term that Bernard Ramm once used to describe Kierkegaard. He called him the Danish time bomb. Beautiful little idea, invented by Bernard Ramm. What he was referring to here is this. Kierkegaard, who died in 1855, remained largely unknown until the late 1920s. Forgotten, buried, ignored. Remember, his writings were in Danish, in the Danish language. Who could read Danish? So it took about 80 years, 70 years, for Kierkegaard's writings to be translated into first German, then took still another 20, 25 years for his writings to get translated into English. And so Bernard Ramm says, here was a set of explosive ideas that were ticking away for 75 years, and nobody knew about it. Now, there's another important lesson in here, and that lesson is this. It's awfully difficult to identify greatness among your contemporaries. It is awfully difficult to identify greatness among one's contemporaries. If you and I had been alive in 1855, 1860, 1870 and said, who will be the great philosophers of the 19th century? Nobody would have mentioned Kierkegaard. Nobody would have known Kierkegaard. The candidates for philosopher of the century would have included Hegel, I suppose. But they would have also included Herbert Spencer. Have any of you ever heard of Herbert Spencer before? Oh, some of you have. Smart Alex. Well, good. But nobody talks about... Anybody who would take time in a history of philosophy course today to talk about Herbert Spencer, well, you know, I guess he did. Libertarians would talk about Herbert Spencer, but I can't think of anybody else. John Stuart Mill. Hardly a guy worth spending a whole lot of time on. Today, we recognize that, you know, the greatest thinkers of the 19th century have to include this guy who died unknown, whose thought lay unknown for 75 years, and who now is one of the pivotal thinkers, I think, of modern times. Let me also say this. I hope that each of you will find time to become acquainted with Kierkegaard's writings. I've become persuaded that he is one of the most dynamic and exciting and forceful Christian writers that any of us can be exposed to. Now, this is not to say that I'm an existentialist, even though he's the father of existentialism. This is not to say that I'm blind to Kierkegaard's faults. But I become convinced by people like the men whose names I've written on the board, that here's a man whose writings ought to be on your bookshelf. You ought to be wrestling with his writings. There's tremendous preaching material in there. Kierkegaard can help you understand yourself better. He can help you understand sin better. He can help you understand salvation better. So pay some attention to Kierkegaard, all right? Enough said. Don't treat him as a precursor of neo-orthodox irrationalism. That's doing him an injustice. Now his life. A Catholic philosopher named James Collins has divided Kierkegaard's life into 4 stages. He calls them the son, the lover. Oh, the lover. That's right. I have to check my notes here. The polemicist and the witness to the truth. The polemicist and the witness to the truth. Should I give you the dates for these? Yeah, why not? 1813 to 1838 would be the years in his life, 1813 to 1838, in which his relationship to his father is paramount. Now, I'm going to be very, very frank with you. Kierkegaard and his whole family were weird. This was probably the biggest pack of misfits, psychological misfits, in the whole country of Denmark. But just because this guy was a psychological basket case doesn't mean that he was not also a man touched of God. You know, I guess one thing we can learn here is no matter how strange you are, God can use you. Put that in your notes, all right? No matter how strange and weird and troubled and psychologically messed up you are in life, God can use you. Now, Kierkegaard got off to a bad start because he had a crazy father. He was born when his father was 56 years old as a product of an extramarital affair. He was a hunchback. He had uneven legs. He was about as ugly as... So here's this poor, deformed man with a hunchback, uneven legs, ugly to look at, psychologically bizarre. His father had a feeling that he was cursed of God. The reason for that was that when his father had been a young man, he'd gotten angry at God, he'd gone out on the seashore, he had shaken his fist at the heavens, and he had cursed God. And his father, after that event, believed that God was after him, that God was out to get him. And then when little Soren was born, deformed, out of this extramarital affair, his father regarded the little boy as part of God's curse upon him. Now you have all the ingredients of a really happy home there, right? His father was subject to fits of depression, as was Kierkegaard. When Kierkegaard went to the University of Copenhagen, he became estranged from his father. He drank heavily. He led an immoral life. In fact, in his journals is to be found, he kept a diary. He kept journals during his years in college. And there's a frightening page in one of his journals where he wrote this sentence. He came home from a party and he wrote these words. He said, "I was the life of the party and I went home and I wanted to kill myself." I was the life of the party and I went home and I wanted to kill myself. This was the kind of life Kierkegaard lived as a university student. Drinking, carousing, chasing women. And this crisis brought him to a kind of moral conversion. There are going to be several conversions in Kierkegaard's life. The first conversion is not a Christian conversion. He's the first to admit that. He reaches the stage in his life, and incidentally, one of the more important elements of his thought is where he talks about the three stages of life. He undergoes a moral conversion. He says, shape up. Quit chasing women, quit living in immorality, quit drinking, and become a man. Begin to live a decent life. And so he has a kind of ethical conversion. And then in 1838, just before his father dies, he has an intense religious conversion. I guess we would call it an evangelical conversion. He is even reconciled with his father, who then dies. So what we have then is this melancholy man, subject to fits of depression, no doubt aided by resentment of his own physical appearance, who has this horrible start from this horrible family situation, and then he falls in love. And we come to the second stage of his life, 1840 to 1843. He meets a lovely girl who actually loves this man. Her name is Regina Olsen. She would have married this deformed man for all of his peculiarities and for all of his physical problems. But Kierkegaard's weirdness destroys the relationship. It's unclear even today what was going on in the man's mind. He would pursue her for a time, and then he would back off and treat her very cruelly. And then he would heat up the relationship again, and she didn't know whether he was coming or going, all right? Finally, she got tired of this and she became engaged to another man, which devastated Kierkegaard again. This is the last thing this neurotic needed, was for this woman to reject him. But she rejected him because of his bizarre behavior. So what he began to do was write cryptic messages to her in his books. He would write a book called Either Or, which is a terribly complex philosophical treatise, and it was full of little coded messages to Regina that he thought might help her understand him and sympathize a little better. And little Regina didn't understand philosophy. She didn't know what this crazy guy was doing. And so she finally marries, and this breaks up, this breaks the man up again. Incidentally, the man she married became governor of the Danish West Indies, which today would be the Virgin Islands. So she left Denmark. She and her husband had come to this part of the world. So we have this poor strange guy. Now, the polemicist, 1843 to 1848, he gets into a public squabble with the most widely read magazine in Copenhagen. It would be like Time magazine or Newsweek. He just picks a fight with this magazine, and of course, they've got all of the exposure they need to hold him up to public ridicule. The magazine was called The Corsair, Corsair. And so Kierkegaard, nobody reads his books, but everybody in Copenhagen reads The Corsair, and they print cartoons of this little hunchback man with his funny hat. And everybody recognizes Kierkegaard as he's walking down the street, and so he becomes a target of public ridicule. During this time, he writes acute analyses of guilt. As he walks down the street, children throw rocks at him. It's a terrible time. But finally, all of these troubles bring him to another religious conversion where he finally forgets what people think about him and says, I'm going to be the witness to the truth. I'm going to be God's witness to this corrupt city and this corrupt church, the state church of Denmark. And so during his last few years, he attacks Lutheran Christendom. He writes a scathing attack upon it, one of the books being called Attack on Christendom. It's a book you all ought to read. There's a difference between Christendom, the public practice of Christianity, and the religion of the New Testament. For example, and I'm coming to a close. In the state church in Denmark, Kierkegaard says, everybody's a Christian. Nobody's going to hell in Denmark because everybody in Denmark has been baptized into the Lutheran Church. But the New Testament says, straight is the way, and narrow is the gate that leadeth unto life everlasting, and few there be that find it. The religion of the New Testament is a totally different religion from what's being preached in the state church in Denmark. Well, if you're the only person in the whole country making this argument, and you have the press against you and the state church against you, you're in real trouble. And so Kierkegaard, at the age of 42, died alone and unloved. And you want to know what the state Lutheran Church did? They wanted to conduct his funeral. And his friends were frantic with resentment and anger. You drove this man to his grave, and now you want to come and pray pious words over his grave. Well, this is a brief introduction to Kierkegaard's life.